I will now turn to Nicolas Mayer from PwC to give us a rundown of the current global economic outlook and future investment prospects. As has been said so many times, it's the economy, stupid. So let's find out what is happening. So Nicolas, if we can bring you up, hopefully we can in a second. What has just happened when it comes to the economy and travel?
I'm here.
There he is. Hello.
There we are.
You saved my life.
Good morning, Raja. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What has just happened? So two levels, and I think I would like to start with this. So first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that a lot of loss of life and livelihoods has happened. And I think as we talk about the potential of the future, the promise of the future, the ability to get out there, which I absolutely believe on, I still think nevertheless, to have a short thought of saying, okay, well, first and foremost, a lot of tough things have happened for a lot of people is important to state here. Flipping, nevertheless, in a more analytics point of view, something that is quite interesting what has happened in this context is we've actually had a dual disruption, right? So we've had a disruption of demand due to the inability to travel. And at the same time, we've had a disruption of supply chains or of value chain. So most of the past crises that we have addressed, 9/11, financial crisis, etc., it was either one or the other. Either it was a disappearance or a reduction of demand, or it was the inability to connect markets. And here we've had both. And that's what makes this situation so tricky, because you can fix one or the other, but unless you fix both of them, you can't really get tourism back. You can't get the motor to turn again, right? And since the various markets are in different stages of still in the crisis or coming out of it, and they're coming out of it in different speeds and with different policies, what has happened is that basically we have entered ourselves in a crisis that we have less recipes of getting out of than we've had for past ones. And I think that's the big catch-22 that most of us are struggling with in our businesses and with our clients.
Because I've seen some of the figures here, and we're talking before COVID-19, the global travel and tourism sector grew by 3.9% and outpaced the global economy, a growth of 2.5%, and gave a contribution of US dollars 8.9 trillion, which represents 10.3% of global GDP. I mean, there's a lot of figures there, but basically it's a big amount. So in order to make travel a key driver in the global economy, what steps need to be taken? Tell me that much. And do you expect a V-shape or a U-shape recovery?
There's two questions there. Let me start with the second one first. So the honest answer is that for many markets, none of us knows, because many of the variables that determine whether a curve is going to be a U, a V, or potentially perhaps even a L in the worst case, right? A drop and then a flatness. Many of the things that will define that are yet to happen, right? So that what makes this forecasting so difficult. Something else that is important there is different markets will not have the same curves. And there are, I mean, if we look at, for example, China and how they have come out of their most acute phase of the pandemic, there is quite strong elements of something that nears a V, also driven by their very strong domestic tourism. If you look, for example, at many island destinations, which are entirely usually dependent on, air connectivity, and basically they're much more dependent on what other countries do to even have a chance of hosting tourists, there you're almost doomed to a U, and it could be an L, depending on how fast these things come in. So I think we need to have a lot of sensitivity when we make these projections of saying, while this is a global industry, it is a sum of very localized patterns and developments, and therefore it is a mix of all of that. Now, going back to your first questions, what can governments or supranational financing entities or regional governments or so do to make this as much a V as possible, and a beautiful V? So So when we speak to those in government responsible for planning these elements within their own ecosystem, I think we need to acknowledge that there is very different phases to different different financing models to different phasings of how to come out of these ones. I think in most places we've come out of the early phase, which was basically the stabilization funding that was needed to make sure that the ripple through the economy was no further. So that was technical unemployment, postponements of taxes, reductions of VAT rates, all these elements that we've seen in various combinations pretty much across the world. We're still, those are maintained right now still, but the reflection now goes in a different kind of financing, which is the financing of the upswing, right? So Gloria said it before, and I absolutely agree. The demand side of wishing to come up, of tourism will come back very strong as soon as it's possible. I don't foresee a fundamental reduction in the desire to travel. And we have no indications from customer sentiment feelings that this is going to be the case. So the demand will be coming up. But if we wish to welcome that demand with, healthy companies that can actually accommodate it, the financing model now basically needs to go in helping companies to ramp up again, which is a different type of financing mechanisms. The most scary thing for me in the short term, as I look into a variety of markets that I work in, is the moment that tourism ecosystems start opening up again, and especially the ones in destinations, hotels and so on, there is a valley of death that you need to survive, which is basically the period of time where you start having cash outflows again because you're ramping up, and where your first cash inflows come in. And if we take, for example, the hotel sector specifically as a subsector, that can be as much as 150 days from the moment that you start having your own outlays again, because you need to hire your people back, you need to invest in inventories, you need to get your marketing going again, and by that, so you have lots of cash outflows there, and the first cash inflows usually come after your guest has left, either through the remittance from the credit card companies or the tour operator, and that period can be about 150 days. Could be shorter or longer, but it's quite long. And only the fewest hotel operators, and it goes the same for ground handlers and others, are currently, after these 3 months of crisis, in a situation where they can independently finance that ramp up. So to your point of what can government do to make sure that there is a tourism in the future, they need to develop these models of saying, okay, how do I finance and support my local tourism ecosystem so that they can survive this valley of death and starting getting in cash positive territory again, at which point, with a lot of pain and a lot of work, but you should be okay, right, to take advantage. So that's the reflections that those in charge of tourism financing have to do themselves.
So they have to provide a kind of backstop, in a sense, so that when you have that situation where you have a liquidity issue, you need the World Bank or whoever and the individual governments to step up and go, right, we'll support you during this period. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but yes, and government probably will have to and can and is helping. But you can't just point a finger at government and say, this is your job, because it's a job for us in the industry. So this also means that, for example, the various participants in a guest journey, in a tourism value chain, need to also renegotiate, for example, together, quite frankly, cash flows, right? All the way down to the tourists. And I know that's a tough message to say, but to some extent, us as travelers need to perhaps also do a gesture and say, well, if I can, I'm happy to do an on-account payment or to share the risk of a cancellation, etc., so that there actually is tourism destinations down the road to which I can travel. So this is for all of us in this ecosystem. We need to be collaborative to the extent of our possibilities in how we basically get the cash circulating again, so that the supply chain is not disrupted.
Just finally, I asked this question to Gloria, and I'll ask it to you as well. And considering what you've just said, is this a good time to invest? Why should people invest in travel?
So first of all, yes, it is. And I think the reasons are manifold. But I mean, we need to remember that well, I should be careful, but for all intents and purposes, this is a brutal but black swan disruption, right? that has come and basically made an industry crash that otherwise was on the longest growth run of any industry in the world. I mean, I think since the oil crisis of 73, tourism has grown every year, and it has generated jobs every year, and it has generated more visitors every year in new territories, etc. So if you almost take kind of like a stock market point of view, you know, it may actually, if you can, be the best time to invest in it right now, because you may indeed, without being too opportunistic, nevertheless be able to find entry into certain markets and participate in the rebuild thereof. I think the other reason why you want to invest in tourism, or why it is an appropriate idea to invest in tourism right now, is because while I'm not sure that everything will change, I'm not necessarily one of the proponents that says, you know, future tourism will look totally different than old tourism. Nevertheless, I believe certain niches that have not been sufficiently been addressed before, be they in certain regional niches or in certain service level niches, will see a particular upswing. You know, in the area of health tourism, of spa tourism, in countries that have basically an underdeveloped or a nascent tourism industry. So there, I think there is great windows of opportunities, and obviously you need to find them, but they will be quite successful, and especially if you're in for the long run. So yes, absolutely, invest in tourism.
Good. There is a reason for us all to be here. Thank you for that. Thank you very much indeed, Nick Mayer. Thank you from PwC.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everyone.